Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for coming out tonight, coming to Woodland Park Presbyterian Church for the I Am Troy Davis book tour, part 2. This is the second round of the book tour. So I'm going to introduce Jen. I started to tell you the story about Jen and how this happened. She came to speak 3 years ago, like I said, speaking about 1 hour of sunlight. The t-shirt that she was wearing was an I Am Troy Davis t-shirt. She was speaking in September of 2011, and although she was engaged in telling us about this book, 1 hour of sunlight, her heart was with Troy Davis. She was beside herself. She was telling everybody at those last hours and days and weeks how important it was. What else could we do? What could we do? So here we are today to learn more about these stories and talk about this. Jen has written several books and is a filmmaker. And the other thing I want to say is that every Christmas I get a card from donkeysaddle.org from Jen Marlowe. And what I love about this card is it tells the things that she hopes to do in the coming year and what she has done in the past year. And I'm just always amazed at how she makes those things happen. She sets goals for helping the world in whatever way the human rights calls her, and she is open to that. And so I would just like to introduce Jen Marlowe.
For folks here who don't know Abby, when I got that email from her, I don't know, maybe 6 weeks ago saying, hey, would we be able to do an event? I'm like, I was like, Abby Brockway, like she's a legend in this town, like Keystone XL actions and environmental activism and all kinds of interrelated social justice issues. And so it's really been such an amazing privilege and honor to get to work with you, Abby, and all of the different co-sponsors. It was so amazing. We were sort of really throwing this together at the last minute, knowing we had this opportunity where Kim was going to be back in town, and I was reaching out to everyone I could think of to say, hey, do you want to help? Do you want to get on board? Thinking maybe 1 or 2 organizations would be able to participate, and just the response of, every person we asked for help, every organization we asked for help, the enthusiastic response that came in was really just really overwhelmingly wonderful. So thank you all, and it's great to see everyone. Some of you know I kind of, sort of, somewhat temporarily moved to New York about a month ago, and so it doesn't really matter where I say I live because I'm gone all the time anyway. But it's great. I got back yesterday, and then I picked Kim up from the airport, and we went on a ferry ride, and I was looking at the mountains, and I was like, wait, why did I leave? But I didn't really leave. Of course, I'm back now, and I'll continue to be back. I'm going to be speaking in a little bit about the book, but before I do that, I want to introduce my dear friend, who some of you have met before, Kimberly Davis. And, some of you might have heard Kimberly speak at Elliott Bay Books back in October. Some of you might have read parts of I Am Troy Davis, and you might have seen some stories about Kimberly, or you might have heard me speak about her or the Davis family. So you might know already that Kimberly is a tireless advocate to abolish the death penalty. You might know that when her brother Troy was executed and then her sister Martina passed 2 months later, they left on Kim the mantle, the responsibility to continue the fight, and she picked up that mantle with courage and with vitality and with passion. You might know all these things. What you might not know is that Kimberly Davis has a wicked sense of humor. And I've often been the butt of it. And I'll just give a couple quick examples. When the day the book went to press, like it was all designed, we had finished proofreading it, everything like that, everything had been approved. Kim and her family had approved every step of the way. Kim calls me, she said, did the book go to press today? Yes, ma'am, it surely did. Well, we've got a problem, because you see, my nephew doesn't like the cover, so we're gonna have to do something about that. So I'm freaking out. I'm like, what? Oh my God, but the book went to press. She's like, we might have, we're gonna have to pull the plug. We're gonna, and I'm like, and then of course, she was pulling my leg. Her nephew loved the cover. And then, about 7 days ago, I was in the desert in the Nevada-California border, and I'm starting to get these messages from Kim. I get this message, I can't go on the trip next week. Now, we have have 7 events over the next 3 days in Seattle, Olympia, and Portland, and then a conference. And but of course, my main concern was, is everything okay? So yes, there's these events, but so I write her back. What's wrong? Are you okay? Well, I'd get a series of messages. It's complicated, but I have to look after my health. The next message, you know how much I want to speak about the book and speak about the injustice of the system. Next message, but what I really want to tell you is April Fools. So, and I say that not only because I need some sympathy for constantly being the butt of Kimberly's jokes, especially short jokes. She really likes to make short jokes. But I think Kimberly's sense of humor and her spirit and her love and the joy with which she embraces the world comes through each and every pore. Yes, she is a soldier in a fight for justice, but she approaches that fight with love and with joy and with the possibility of the love and the joy that we need to be spreading in the world. And that's a really remarkable way to be a soldier. So without any further words from me, I am honored and pleased to introduce my dear friend, my sister, Kimberly LaShawn Davis. Not everyone gets a standing ovation before they begin, Kim.
Good evening. I just want to thank everyone for coming out. Just want to thank everyone, for your love and support. Because, like my sister has always said, this was a fight that was actually bigger than Troy Davis. This fight started before Troy Davis, and it was not going to end with Troy Davis. One thing that my brother had asked us to do is to continue to fight to end the death penalty. He told us, he said that you have no reason to feel sorry for me. He said, because, you did what you were supposed to do. My brother, he told us, he said that if the state of Georgia did succeed in executing him, he said that, they would only take his physical body because he gave his soul to God a long time ago. And that was something that was, just so very touching to us, to know, like my brother, he told them, he said that, there was nothing else that the state of Georgia could do to him, because he said that, it was left up to God. And he said that if it was his will, if it was God's will for his life to be taken, then he said that, he said that my life was put on this earth to serve a purpose. We get so many letters, still today. I told Jen, it was just like on last week I had gotten a letter from one of the other gentlemen that's still on death row, and he asked me, did I remember him? And he was just thanking me and my family for our continual fight to continue to fight against the death penalty. He said that, it was just so profound. He said, because when my family came to Georgia's death row, said that we didn't only come to give love and support to Troy, we gave love and support to all of them. And we're still, continuing to fight, not only, like I said, not only for my brother, we're fighting for justice for all the men and women that are on death row. We're fighting for the injustice, around the United States. And we're going to end the death penalty state by state. We just want all of y'all, just to continue to pull us together, because like we said, always, knowledge is powerful. It's okay for us to come in and just, gather in an assembly like this, gather together, but what we need to do, we need to take our knowledge that we're learning here, go out and spread the word. We have our elected officials, and they're just that, they're elected officials. If they're not doing what we want them to do, then we need to get their butts out and get someone in that's gonna do what we want them to do. With my brother's case, none of y'all know, but Warden Humphreys was actually the second warden at the prison, from Georgia Department of Corrections where my brother was. The first warden that was there, my brother was under his reign for 17 and a half years. This warden actually spoke up to the parole board for my brother, saying that he believed in my brother's innocence. He said that out of the 17 and a half years that my brother was on Georgia's death row, he did not have one incident that he had to write my brother up. He said that he used my brother's life on death row to help other prisoners that came in to cope with them being on death row. Warden Humphreys, the day that my brother was actually executed, he came to Benjamin Hall Jealous, who was the former president of the NAACP, and he asked Mr. Jealous, he said, do you know who I am? And Ben said, yes, you're the warden of the prison. He said, no, do you really know who I am? And Ben asked him, he's like, well, who are you? He said, I was actually a police officer of the streets of Savannah in 1989 when Officer McPhail was killed. He said that I was not involved directly, but I was involved indirectly. The day that Warden Humphreys came to the prison, when he was coming around, he told my brother, he said that your celebrity days are over. He said, I'm gonna make your last days on earth a living hell. My brother didn't know what he was talking about. When Warden Humphreys got to the prison, before he got to the prison, we had contact visits where we could actually, go in, sit with my brother. We talked. We had, Bible study because we were actually able to bring Bibles in the prison. Warden Humphreys stopped us bringing Bibles in the prison. We had to get the Bibles from the guard towers. Sometimes when we got the Bibles from the guard towers, the Bibles were all torn up, just torn to pieces when people were actually donating new Bibles. Warden Humphreys, he took away contact visits. He said that you had to earn your contact visit, so you can earn one contact visit every 6 months. He didn't stop there. He took away the guys on death row. He took away their commissary, so their families wouldn't be able to buy them foods during their visitation. He took away them getting Christmas boxes. We used to be able to send them 3 15-pound Christmas boxes once a year. But what Warden Humphreys did, he said that in order for the death row inmates to receive a Christmas box, they had to buy it from the prison. And the Christmas boxes for the prison, for one box, it was $100 per box. Whereas if the family sent something, we would usually spend maybe $25, $30 just on snacks to send them. But the prison, just were, without to make money. Warden Humphreys, he stopped them from their arts and craft that they used to do. Troy used to always crochet angels, crochet cross bookmarks, send them to different people. And then he actually put them on a 23-hour lockdown. They had 1 hour a day to either go out on the rec yard, make a 15-minute phone call, or go to take a shower. But it was 1 hour a day that he would give them. He put them on a 23-hour lockdown. 3 weeks before Troy had actually, we had actually gotten his 4th date of execution, Warden Humphreys came to Troy and he told Troy, he said, Davis, he said, you have another execution date coming up. This was after the 11th Circuit, which the lawyers had not even heard from the Georgia Supreme Court. My brother called my sister, frantic, and asked, had he gotten another execution date. My sister called his lawyers, and his lawyer said, Warden Humphreys is just calling your bluff. Lo and behold, 3 weeks after Warden Humphreys told Troy that he was getting another execution date, that we actually got word from the Georgia Supreme Court that they had denied, from the U.S. Supreme Court, that they had denied him having a new trial. So this all played hand in hand, because if the Troy's lawyers didn't know about an execution date, but then Warden Humphreys knew that the U.S. Supreme Court was actually not going to grant him a new trial, it was just all in plan, with the state of Georgia. We had, like I said, 7 out of the 9 witnesses that recanted their statements, but those same witnesses that were credible to convict my brother, when they came back to recant their statements and say how they were coerced by the police, yet still the police said that, they were convicted criminals, their statements and stuff were not credible, but yet still, when we had the 11th Circuit hearing, Judge William Moore actually sat on the stage with his eyes closed as if, he had no care in the world as to what the witnesses were actually saying. There was 9 witnesses that were interviewed, and any of you know, well, some of you may know, like if a police stop you, they have like a little black book that they have to write their reports and stuff down. If they, take someone to the police department to arrest them, their statements are recorded. Out of those 9 witnesses, there was only 1 tape that the lawyers were able to find before we went to the 11th Circuit, getting ready for the 11th Circuit. That was the tape of Detective Sweeney, and it stated his name and said, I'm Detective Sweeney with the Savannah Police Department. And he told one of the witnesses, he said, if you don't tell me what I need to know, if you don't tell me that Troy Davis shot the police officer, I'm going to throw you in jail and label you as a snitch. When Before Detective Sweeney actually testified on the stand with Judge William Moore, the lawyers asked Detective Sweeney, is that his tactic as to interviewing a witness? And he swore before the court, swore before God that was never his tactic. But that one tape was the one tape that actually perjured Detective Sweeney on the stands, and we knew right then and there we were going to get some reproof from the 11th Circuit. But it was like Judge William Moore had came into that court, with his mind, just closed. Even going back, we were talking this morning about the district attorney said that they found blood-stained shorts that they got out of my mother's washing machine. For over 20 years, Spencer Lawton actually sat on evidence that showed that the shorts that they pulled from my mother's washing machine, there was not enough DNA on the shorts to tell whether it was blood, whether it was sweat, or whether it was, cleaning fluid. And even they tried to say that they had a ballistic report that stated that my brother was actually charged with 4 shootings that night Officer McPhail had gotten killed. One of the shootings actually happened at the same time as Officer McPhail, but it happened on a different side of town, so they just swept that shooting under the rug. Another shooting that happened, you had witnesses that came forward and actually stated that they were the ones that shot up at the Cloverdale, that's the neighborhood that we live in. They shot up at a pool party, and they lived in the Yamacraw area. That's where Officer McPhail had gotten killed. And they said that they took the shell casings and put it in their pockets and shook the shell casings out of their pockets as they walked through the neighborhood. So that's how they tried to say that it was, shell casings from the McPhail shooting versus shell casings from the police shooting. But for over 20 years, under Spencer Lawton's reign, he sat on evidence that showed that the bullets on the ballistic report were inconclusive. But yet still, leading up to the time for us to have the evidentiary hearing, they had on the Savannah News Press, blood-stained shorts found in the washing machine of my mother. They had shell casings, but yet still, when we went to the Georgia Supreme Court, and when we went to the parole board in Georgia, the lawyers actually presented this information, which was information that the DA was presenting against my brother, saying that, they had evidence that my brother shot police, and they presented this information to the Georgia Supreme Court as well as the Georgia Department of Parole Board that stated that my brother was innocent. The entire time we were actually fighting prosecutorial misconduct. We were not fighting for my brother's innocence or guilt. We were fighting against procedural bar. We were fighting against the Anti-Terrorism Act that went into effect that went retroactive 10 years. But with my brother's case, my brother told us, he said that, it didn't start with him and it wasn't going to end with him, and he wanted us to continue to fight, continue to spread the word about the injustice, not only in his case, but to continue to help people, see the light about the injustice, just around, our justice system altogether. And, that's what I'm here to do, continue to fight the fight to end the death penalty. And I want y'all, like I said, to join together, not only with me and my family. There are many people that are out there on death row, and some of these people, they have DNA evidence in their cases, some of them don't. But everyone that's sitting on death row is not guilty. We have, I think it's 144 people that were actually exonerated off of death row. Some of them had DNA evidence in their cases, and some of them don't. But what we need to do, we need to stand together and fight, and continue to fight the fight to end the death penalty. Thank you.
I know Kim's about to make a short joke about me. Can y'all see me? Should I stand up? I know, I feel very short next time. Some of the details, there's a lot of twists and turns in Troy's case, and the part of what the book does is really unpack the details of it. But I think some of what Kim outlined today about police coercion of witnesses, about suppression of evidence, about a system that is so stacked against a defendant is really emblematic of the criminal justice system. And of course, the death penalty is the highest stakes consequence of a very broken criminal justice system. The railroading that happened to Troy, the way in which all of the different authorities worked together even when there were supposed to be separations of, between the court system and the DA's office. But of course, there's so much collusion that goes on. I mean, all of these different things that Kim outlined. Troy's case is not an exception. Troy's case, in many ways, opens the window onto a human rights crisis in this country, which is the death penalty system. And another thing that Kim was highlighting, she was highlighting some of what happened once Warden Humphrey took over in the prison and the specific cruelties that Warden Humphrey showed. There were kind guards at the Georgia, at the institution where Troy was facilitated, the Georgia Corrections facility in Jackson, Georgia. There are kind human beings who are prison guards everywhere. The problem isn't whether or not a warden or a guard is kind or is cruel. The problem is a system in which certain people are caged and rendered completely powerless to a system that strives to dehumanize them and to strip them of their dignity. And I think Kim even used these exact words to try to break them down by taking away their ability to hug their loved ones, which of course doesn't just punish the prisoner when we take away contact visits, right? It punishes their loved ones. By taking away their ability to engage in arts and crafts, to have human contact with each other, all of the things that help keep people in touch with their humanity. When you take those things away, there's no other reason that you're doing it except for that you are trying to strip them of their humanity. And given that circumstances, it's all the more remarkable how much Troy was able to hold on to his own dignity and hold on to his own humanity, and not only preserve it, but to spread it to others, so that everyone who came in contact with them felt like they wanted to be the best human being they were able to be, because Troy inspired that in them. And a large reason why Troy was able to do that and able to hold on to his own humanity and indeed to spread it as the way he was because of the Davis family. My first time visiting Troy on death row was, I think it was 2009, early 2009. I went with the Davis family, and they had just taken away the contact visits, and Troy was separated from his family. At that point, it was like an iron grate. It was before they put in the plexiglass and the phones. For a period of maybe 6 months, they had like an iron grate. And so there was a physical barrier of a cage, really, between Troy and his family, and yet at the end of that visit, their visits always ended with holding hands and praying. That's how Troy and his family always ended their visits, and I knew that from Troy having told that to me. And I was wondering, well, how are they going to, have their circle of prayer now? Because now Troy is separated from his family by a steel grate. And when the visit was ending and it came time to end, the rest of the family, and including me, because I was there with them, so that made me a part of the family that day. We all held hands in a semicircle, and Troy's mom was on one end of the semicircle, and his nephew Dejan on the other end, and as if they had planned it in advance, as if it was something they had talked about or knew that they were going to do it this way. Troy, from his side of the iron gates, just leaned up and pressed his hands against the iron gates, and grate, and Virginia, Troy's mom, on the other end, pressed her hand against her son's with the grate in between, and Dejan on the other side, and they didn't let the iron grate stop them from being able to have their circle of prayer, and they never let guards and guns and barbed wire and guard towers and concrete walls stop them from being a family, with all the warmth and the love that represented. And I think it's that warmth and that love that first drew me to the Davis family. And when I first started corresponding with Troy, and then about a year later met Martina here in Seattle, actually, a friend of Troy's named Megan Thomas, who lives here in Seattle, had invited, when Martina was coming out to Seattle to speak, had invited Megan and me over to her house, and we started talking, and that was when Martina brought up this idea of that she wanted to write a book, and my wheels started spinning, and I thought, well, maybe I could help them with that. But what made me so committed to wanting to stand with this family and be in solidarity with them and stand by their side as they waged the struggle was that humanity and that dignity and that warmth and love that even iron cages and barbed wire and guard towers could not strip from the Davis family and could not strip from Troy. And that's how I got involved with working with them, both working to try to prevent the execution of Troy, to abolish the death penalty, and to make sure that Troy and Martina's story would be told. Martina and I started working on the book around 2009, right after we met in Seattle that time, but really we were working on it in kind of bits and snatches of time, and I had other projects that I was completing, and then obviously as 2011 grew closer and as the drumbeat to execution grew louder, of course the book wasn't really the priority. The priority was doing everything we could to prevent the execution. So the book was kind of being worked on here and there, and I made several trips to Savannah and did extensive interviews with Martina and Kim and Virginia and Dejan, and when I first visited Troy in prison, we devised a way surreptitiously through letters and phone calls that he could contribute to the book. The prison authorities, of course, could not know that he was doing that because they would have taken it out on him in different ways, so we had to, we devised a system where I'd write a letter, and in the letter I would just say, "So Troy, I'd love to hear more about your childhood," and he would understand that this was for the book, and then he would write me pages and pages of memories and stories about his childhood with the understanding that that would be for the book. So Troy was able to participate directly, but really the book was Martina's story, Troy's sister Martina, and it was Martina's double struggle fighting for her own life so that she could fight for her brother's life. Because in 2001, Martina was diagnosed with terminal breast cancer. And at the time she was diagnosed, the doctor said that she most likely had up to 6 months to live. And at that time, this was 2001, Martina was the single mom of a 6-year-old little boy with a brother on death row who's innocent, she was fighting to prove, and she did not accept that diagnosis. And she decided that she needed to fight as fiercely as she possibly could for her own life so that she could raise her son and that she could free her brother. And that is what she continued to do. And as we got closer to the execution date, Martina's health declined precipitously. And the whole summer leading up to the execution, Martina was in the hospital. And we knew every day an execution date was imminent. It was just waiting for it to be announced. And when it finally was announced, it was announced on September 6, 2011, and it was set for 2 weeks after that. Martina pretty much busted out of the hospital in order to be there with and for Troy during what turned out to be his final days. And we'll hear more about the night of the execution itself as the evening goes on, but after the execution, which ultimately was on September 21st, 2011, Martina got a letter from Troy that was postmarked on September 21st. And she couldn't open it for a while. It took her about a week after his funeral till she could bring herself to open it. And when she did finally open it, in the letter he had written to her, "Make sure you finish writing your book." That was in his final letter to his sister. And Martina called me that day, right then, and she said, "This book is now my highest priority." So, of course, from that moment on, it also became my highest priority. And we worked feverishly in what turned out to be the last 2 months of Martina's own life. And in those 2 months, I was actually the one saying to Martina, we had done a lot of the work covering the areas of her life previously. What we hadn't done was those past 6 months, starting with the death of Virginia, their mom, which happened in April 2011, and then from that point on, the U.S. Supreme Court denying Troy's final appeal. Actually, that was 2 weeks before Virginia died, and then the lead up to the execution and the execution itself. And I was saying to Martina, we don't have to go there yet. We can wait till those memories aren't so raw. We can fill in other gaps and kind of wait before we cover that material. And Martina was the one who said, "No, let's do it now while it's still fresh." And I think she realized that she didn't have a lot of time left. And I think she wanted to make sure that she honored Troy's final wish to her in that letter, that this story be told. And so in those 2 months, that's exactly what she did. And then when Martina passed on December 1st, 2011, she was buried on December 10th, which is very fittingly International Human Rights Day, because Martina was a human rights warrior. Then it became my task to take all that material and to do the writing of the book. And there's dear friends in this room whose condos I utilized in the writing of that book, and dear friends who know what a struggle it was, and Kim and the rest of the Davis family were determined that Troy and Martina's story be out there, and we worked together to make that happen with the understanding and with the goal, again, like Kim said, and Kim said it so eloquently, that yes, it's Troy's story, but it's not just about Troy. It's about the larger injustice of the justice system. It's about the human impact of the death penalty system. And our hope is that through Troy's story, it exposes those larger injustices, and it inspires us to stand with Martina, with Troy, with Kimberly, and with all of the Davis family. And the name of the book, I'm Troy Davis, and the slogan, I'm Troy Davis, that was the slogan of the movement to prevent Troy's execution. Of course, was never just about Troy either. I am Troy Davis is a much larger slogan, and it's a call of solidarity, not only for people who are wrongfully imprisoned, but for all people who are, and families and children and parents, and who are so injured by our criminal justice system on so many levels in so many ways. So with that being said, what we want to do now is give you the opportunity to hear a couple passages from the book. I first met, second time I met Gerald was when Martina came to Seattle, and Troy, sitting in his cage, it's the only way you can describe it, on death row in Georgia, knew that myself and his friend Megan were both out in Seattle, so he's making sure that Megan and I are being hooked up with each other. Then he knew that Martina was coming out to Seattle to speak, so he's making sure that the two of us are hooked up to Martina. So he's creating this web of human connections, all from his cage on death row in Georgia. And so then when Martina came out here, Megan and I and Gerald went out for lunch. And at that time, 2009, Gerald, you had just been released a couple months before that, right? Gerald had spent 23 years in prison for a crime he did not commit, starting from, I believe, the age of 17. From the age of 17 years old. Some of that time spent on death row, correct? And then the rest of it not on death row, but with a life sentence. And Gerald's activism started from inside prison. I mean, his work organizing and becoming a social justice activist started behind bars, and then finally, when he was released in 2009, he got very active with the NAACP and with criminal justice reform and all manners of social justice. And so standing before you today is the president of Seattle's chapter of the NAACP and president of Washington, Alaska, and Oregon's chapter of NAACP, Gerald Hankerson. Standing next to Gerald, we have Mary Paterson, who is an organizer with No Jim Crow Seattle campaign. And Mary's consciousness of social injustice, it had its roots in Berkeley, California, where she comes from, but it was when she opened up the pages of the book, The New Jim Crow by Michelle Alexander, that the dots started being connected. And I know that's true for me, and it's probably true for anyone who has picked up that book. You can't read that book without all of a sudden connecting so many dots between our criminal justice system and how that is connected to earlier forms of racial and social control that we've had in this country, including segregation, that's the name of the book, and slavery before that. And so Mary, along with other activists in Seattle, started No New Jim Crow Seattle as a way first to study the premises of Michelle Alexander's book, and then to try to figure out how to take action, how to bring down that system of racial control and replace it with an actual system of true and real justice. And standing next to Mary is Jesse Hagopian, who, and I can't even remember actually when I met Jesse, except that I know I knew of him long before I actually met him. Jesse teaches history and is the Black Student Union Advisor at Garfield High School, which was the site, in his bio, Jesse writes, it's the site of the historic boycott of the MAP test and mentioned in his bio that he spearheaded that historical boycott. And so he is a passionate education reform activist, a passionate social justice activist. We've crossed paths on criminal justice reform panels, on Palestine justice those folks who works not only on all these different issues, but looking at how those dots are connected and how larger patterns of oppression and marginalization are at force, and not only works to overturn them, but is actively involved in training the next generation of activists, AKA his students, to overturn them as well. And he's actually a candidate for president in the current election of the Seattle Education Association. And that deserves some applause. So Gerald is going to read first, and Gerald is going to read a passage that took place in 1991. It was very soon after Troy had arrived on death row. The murder that Troy was convicted for happened in 1989. He was convicted in 1991. He went to death row shortly thereafter. The passage actually is from a few years after that, but Troy was still pretty new on death row, and he had lived through a few executions at that point of cellmates, of other prisoners on the row. But when Chris Berger was executed, it was different for Troy because Chris Berger was Troy's best friend on death row.
Wow, thank you for giving me the opportunity to read this. I read this and I was like, actually made me cry. Troy had never intended to make friends on death row, but there was something disarming about Chris Berger. Chris was tall, trim, strong, and gave off a tough demeanor, but he showed warmth and affection to his friends. He sketched beautifully with colored pencils, often sending his drawings to his mother, to whom he was devoted. He was older than Troy by more than 10 years, but there was something vulnerable and childlike about him, perhaps stemming from his history of severe child abuse. Chris had been only 17 years old when he had participated in the murder of Roger Honeycutt. When his execution date was set for December 7, 1993, he confessed to Troy how frightened he was. Troy saw the guards parading Chris sadistically in front of the other death row inmates on the evening of December 7th before leading him to the execution chamber to strap him into the electric chair. Troy sat in his cell, hunched over his bed, waiting for the horrifying moment when the lights would flicker, indicating that a high voltage current of electricity was coursing through Chris's body. Every man on the row twitched in silent agony when the flickering began at 9:50 p.m. Troy knelt on the hard floor, gripping the steel frame of his bed tightly, and prayed for his friend. Only later did he learn that Chris Berger's last words had been an apology to everyone he had ever hurt and a plea for forgiveness. One of the guards who had paraded Chris leaned against the bars of Troy's cell. "Hey, Davis," Troy heard the guard say. Troy looked up. "Yeah. How'd you like some fries to go with your burger?" Troy resolved never to become quite so closely to anyone else on death row again.
We've used this technique of having different readers in all the cities we've gone to, which has been amazing, both an amazing way to highlight the voices of different community activists, but also a really powerful and poignant lens through which to hear these stories. And Gerald, hearing you read those words is, for me, it's like, not only it's as if I didn't write them, but as if I had not heard them before. I talked a little bit ago, and Kim referenced it also, about Martina and Martina's double struggle for her own life so that she could fight for Troy's life. Martina and Troy were 17 months apart, but they referred to each other often as twins. And Martina often said that their struggles were interlocked, twin struggles, twin souls, she often said. And I spoke a bit about the moment where Martina realized that she couldn't give up. It just wasn't a possibility, and I think that determination is the backbone of the essence of the Davis family, the essence of Martina, and the essence of her twin soul, Troy. And Mary's passage deals a little bit with that time period and that moment.
It was another bad night of vomiting, retching, and diarrhea. Martina stayed curled up in bed in the morning, listening to the sounds of Mama getting Dijon ready, and then everyone leaving the house. In another few weeks, her son would be 7 years old. In another few months, her brother would have spent 10 years on death row. Martina scratched her head, coming away with a clump of hair. She stared at the fistful of hair for a long moment before pushing back the blanket, slowly sitting up in bed and pushing her feet into her slippers. She had a child to raise and a brother to get off of death row. It was time to get up. Martina opened the front door. She took one shuffling step and then another, making it as far as the mailbox, against which she leaned for support, feeling the warm Georgia sun beat down on her face. "Tina, you all right?" was her neighbor from across the street. "I'm all right." She let the sun warm her for a few more minutes. She might be dying, but she wasn't dying today. She made her way back into the house and, without fully realizing what she was doing, found herself in the bathroom rubbing a generous amount of Nair onto her head. When Dijon came home that afternoon, Martina was waiting for him on the couch, wearing her favorite dress and her head fully wrapped in a colorful scarf with an African motif. As he approached her to give her a hug, she pulled off the scarf, unveiling a shiny, bald head. Dijon jumped back for a moment. Then he wrapped his arms around her and squeezed tightly. "It doesn't look bad, Mom. You look really pretty today." She got up the next day and walked a few steps further. "Come on, let's walk down the street," her neighbor suggested the day after that. Martina took her hand and they slowly made their way to the corner and back. When Trevor picked her up to take her to chemo, Martina was fully made up, wearing jewelry and loud Caribbean colors. "I might have cancer," she told him when he looked at her quizzically, "but cancer does not have me." Martina's strength slowly returned, and as her renewed strength lasted, she decided that not only was she not dying today, she also wasn't dying tomorrow. She likely wasn't dying next week or even next month. She could take a deep breath, relax, and live her life without worrying that every moment might be her last. Perhaps her illness was her Creator's way of telling her, "I need your attention. There's more that you need to do, and I need you to do it more abundantly." If she wasn't dying today, then she was going to live today.
I think Kim mentioned that by the time Georgia succeeded in executing Troy, it was their fourth attempt. Troy had survived 3 previous execution dates, and the first of those was in 2007. And the passage that Jesse is going to read takes place the day before, about 23 hours before that scheduled execution. There had just been a day-long parole board meeting in front of the Georgia State Board of Pardons and Parole, appealing for clemency, and the family was back in the hotel waiting anxiously for the parole board's decision.
July 16, 2007. An unfamiliar number appeared on Martina's caller ID at 8 p.m. "Hello? Martina? Yes. This is the New York Times. How do you feel?" "How do I feel about what?" "About Troy's stay." "What stay?" "The parole board gave Troy a 90-day stay of execution." Martina threw the phone down and began to leap around the hotel room. "Troy gotta stay! Troy gotta stay!" she screamed. Just then, Mama's cell phone rang. Virginia punched through the numbers as quickly as she could so that she could hear Troy's voice. "Hi, Mama, how'd the hearing go?" Virginia put her cell phone on speaker so Troy could hear Martina, who was still dancing around and shouting ebulliently. "You hear that, honey?" The family's huddled around Virginia's cell phone to hear Troy's reaction. For a moment, there was silence. Then, almost inaudible, "Thank you, God," followed by another, "Thank you, God," this time a little louder. Troy did something he did regularly. Troy prayed. Then he did something he almost never did. Troy began to cry. 2 guards led Troy from the death house back to his cell block. Fellow death row inmates lined up at the doors of their cells, extending their arms through the iron bars to grasp Troy's hands as he walked down the row. "Praise God, brother," one of them called out to him, tears in his eyes. "Maybe at least one of us will survive this place." Another cheered. Troy's friend shoved small items through the bars for him to take back, items that Troy had bequeathed to them the previous day. A bottle of shampoo, some extra stamps, a few envelopes, his belt, and his shoes. Troy, head high and a new spring in his step, walked into his cell. He heard the familiar clank of the door locking behind him, but at that moment, he was not focused on his confinement. He was focused on his life. Georgia had intended to take it from him in less than 24 hours. And his family and scores of supporters had fought, and they had prevailed.
Thank you. Wow, you guys are all hired. Can you come on book tour with us? Thank you. You know, I like to end the readings with the reading that Jesse just ended with, but I think maybe more powerfully than I've ever heard it read, and that's true for all three of you, because obviously there's tragedy in the story of what happened to Troy, and of course the story of what's happened to so many other people and so many other families, but I think the passage that Jesse read also shows that there is triumph. And that there is victory, and that there are moments where, yeah, we are beating the odds, we are winning, and that's happening in the fight against the death penalty. We are winning that fight. In the 2.5 years since Troy was killed, and I think partly because Troy was killed, and because people were so shocked and outraged that the state of Georgia could go ahead with killing a man when there was a mountain of evidence pointing towards his innocence. I think that's one of the reasons why that first Connecticut and then Maryland have repealed the death penalty. I think that's one of the reasons why Oregon, just months after Troy was killed, placed a moratorium on their executions. And then, of course, as we know, in February, Jay Inslee here in Washington did the same. New Hampshire is in the midst. This week, the New Hampshire Senate is going to vote on whether or not they're going to repeal. It already passed the New Hampshire House by a vast majority. Now it's in the Senate, where it is going to be a very, very tight and close race. I think there's basically, it's between 3 votes is what I've heard. But slowly, step by step, the Pew Center just put out a research report that shows that support for the death penalty, this was just done, I think, a month ago, is at an all-time low in this country since the death penalty was reinstated in 1976. So all the trends are moving in the direction that we will be abolishing the death penalty. And I want to invite Gerald and Mary and Jesse to take seats up here, and I want to invite Brynn Smith to join them. And in a few moments, we're going to have an opportunity for Q&A. But before we do that, Brynn is going to speak a little bit about what the struggle is right now. What is this moment right here in Washington State to end the death penalty? Brynn is very uniquely poised to discuss this. Brynn has worked with the Safe and Just Alternatives campaign since its inception in 2011. She's now with the ACLU, which is the American Civil Liberties Union, Washington State, which is one partner of the Safe and Just Alternatives campaign, but before working for the ACLU, she was working with the Washington Coalition to Abolish the Death Penalty, which is the other partner for the Safe and Just Alternatives campaign. So Brynn has been wading very deeply into these waters for a long time, and so we want to start off with Brynn having an opportunity to discuss what we can do right here, right now.
Hello. Well, I first just want to thank both Jen and Kim for inviting us all to be here today for this wonderful event. As the ACLU, we're very honored to co-sponsor this very important event. The death penalty repeal issue is a priority of the ACLU Washington. I
work there as the outreach coordinator. I do a lot of outreach with murder victims, family members, other members of the community, and I'm honored to be here on the stage with all three of you as well. So just to talk a little bit about our work at the ACLU and what the Safe and Just Alternatives campaign actually is we are an umbrella campaign. The Safe and Just Alternatives is a campaign that includes the NAACP, the League of Women Voters, the Faith Action Network, the Washington Coalition to Abolish the Death Penalty, and a litany of other organizations that have been working for years, decades, on this issue. And we just decided to come together and form this umbrella campaign so that we can present a united front at the legislature. Our primary goal is to specifically via legislation repeal the death penalty and replace it with life in prison without the possibility of parole. Right now, you may ask what we are doing to achieve that. Well, Governor Inslee's moratorium was certainly a game changer. You know, for the past number of years, repeal bills have been introduced with the legislature, but the moratorium, it's just changed everything. It sparked a whole new debate. We've seen it, new media coverage across the state. It's very encouraging, and we believe that lawmakers we know that our lobbyist team has been speaking with lawmakers, and we know that this is an issue that they will be seriously considering next year during the legislative session. During the interim, since the legislative session ended earlier in March, during the interim, we're just going to continue having conversations, a lot of important dialogue with people on both sides of the issue. Traditionally, this issue has been primarily a progressive issue, but I'm really excited to say that in Washington State, we have a lot of bipartisan support, more than people would initially expect. We've had our first Republican sponsor, Representative Maureen Walsh from Walla Walla, actually, sponsored our repeal bill this past biennium, and we're hoping to have Republican champions in both caucuses next year. So that's an important step, is to have everybody on board, not just one particular angle, to have a broad coalition of voices, opinions, political ideology, to have a really diverse group. And we're really, for the first time, starting to see that, which is encouraging. So what can you do to help abolish the death penalty? We've brought a simple action. It doesn't take long, but it goes a long way. And we have these postcards, a single piece of paper for each constituent. And on the back, you see three large icons. These are each different postcards that will go to your 2 district representatives and your senator. And this top portion is just where you have to fill out your name and address. If you don't want to give your phone number or your email, that's perfectly fine. But we'd appreciate it if you would put your address in so that we can identify your legislative district. And what we're going to do is collect these until the next legislative session, when we plan to have a repeal bill introduced in both the House and Senate. We plan to have another lobby day, and at that time we will be hand delivering these postcards, hopefully thousands and thousands of them, from constituents across Washington to legislators. And so these postcards are at the ACLU table. Some people have said, well, I've signed one of these before. Well, every year we hand these into legislators, so if you've not signed one tonight, then I would encourage you to sign a new one, because we're starting all over with our collection. In addition to this, if you're wondering what you can do, one of the most important things is just raising the profile of the issue. You talk with your friends, talk with your coworkers, talk with your family, even if they disagree with you about the issue. We're not going to convince anyone by fighting with them, but starting the dialogue and expecting that it might be a long time to have a productive conversation. But that's really the first step. So we encourage you to talk with folks, certainly talk with your legislators, your elected officials. They need to know that they have support. a lot of them are prepared and are sympathetic, but they're not really ready to join the parade unless they know that they have their constituents backing them up. So I'm also happy to field any questions if anyone has any.
Thank you, Brynn. So now we're getting into the ask and the what can you do portion of this. We're going to have a question and answer period. But before that, I want to just inspire you and invite you to connect at a deeper level. I know many of you here are already doing a lot, but what else can we do? What are some of the things that we can do? Well, first of all, we're here tonight. I'm going to pass around an ask. And this is a scholarship fund for Dewan. And this is Troy's nephew. And Troy's nephew is at college. And Jen's going to talk a little bit more about that. And I am going to be passing this around as she talks about Dewan and also a couple others.
So you've heard a little bit tonight about Dejan, about Troy's nephew, a phenomenal young man who really grew up being, who grew up partly on death row, spent every Saturday of his life from birth to the age of 17 visiting Troy on death row and was really co-raised by Troy. And Dejan is Martina's son. That is the little boy that when Martina was diagnosed, she was determined that she was going to live to raise her son. And Martina wanted nothing so much as to see Dejan graduate from high school, and she almost made it. When his mom died, Dejan was 6 months away from his high school graduation. And he lost his grandmother, his uncle, who was his father figure, and his mother, all in a 6-month period. And it is amazing to me when I look at him today, a first-year student at Morehouse College who made Dean's List in his first semester, and I see him working hard, studying hard, having fun. You know, some folks here have already supported his first year of education, and when we were composing an email of thank you to write to his supporters, and I was asking Dejan, okay, what do you want to say? He's like, well, tell everyone, he's trying to search for the right words. He's like, tell everyone who supported me, thank you for helping me get my mojo back. Which is exactly what it is. And, you know, Jesse knows this probably more than anyone. I think all of here know it's one of the best ways to create the kind of change we need to create is to support the young people who are out there in the world doing it and to help build their potential to be able to be the kind of leaders we need, the kind of activists we need. And I can tell you that supporting Dejan's education is one of the best ways to do that. So that's being passed around. Another thing I want to pass around is my email sign-up sheet with a very specific purpose. I mean, some of you are already on my email list. You don't have to re-sign up, but specifically I want folks to sign up on this if they want to get more information about the action that we're doing on September 21st, which will be the 3-year anniversary of Troy's execution. We're asking for folks to host community book club, is what we're calling it, which is a very simple concept. On September 21st, all over the country, all over the world, there's going to be hopefully hundreds of simultaneous book club discussions around this book, using it as a way to widen and deepen the discourse.
We're going to get out there and fight in the death penalty together. Thank you.